Well, thank you, Mr. Diamond, for finding time in your busy schedule to talk to Tabula. Well, what brings you to Georgia? What's your interest in this country?
Well, my interest in this country is because, first of all, it's an emerging or aspiring democracy. It's trying to make democracy work in a difficult part of the world. Secondly, we've had at Stanford University a number of your political and civic leaders who've come to spend each 3 weeks of time at our university and our Draper Hill Summer Fellows program. So we've gotten to know some people in your political system and civil society who we've come to have a high regard for, and it's an important partner of the United States in a strategic area of the world, and it's a beautiful and wonderful country.
How would you describe the state of Georgian democracy? Well, you know probably that majority of the opposition leaders are in jail or have fled the country for the fear of being put in jail. The rest are under investigation or prosecution. Well, government blames the civil society in subversive activities and blames media in creating chaos. Many fear that Georgian democracy is backsliding.
In terms of democratic backsliding, of course you always have to compare it with what existed before. I'm not enough of an expert on Georgia to do that. I think that in the previous administration under President Saakashvili and his party, there was an international perception, and I think at least for a while a domestic sense, that enormous progress had been made in reforming and modernizing the state and combating corruption, particularly at the level of the police and the functioning of the state in daily life. Yeah. There were some extraordinary achievements made that a lot of other people in the world are looking at now. There was a sense, on the other hand, that you know, power had been maybe abused somewhat or had gone beyond its constitutional mandate. I'm not in a position to judge it in a you know, in an authoritative way, but I think there were some valid and legitimate concerns about you know, the way in which presidential power or executive power, since it's not fully or wasn't then a presidential system, and it's, I guess, even less of one now, how it was exercised. While appreciating the enormous and I think historic reforms that were adopted under the previous administration, it's important not to idealize the past or to ignore some of the problems of the quality of democracy and of the performance and exercise of political power in the previous administration. I think that there are also very significant and worrisome concerns and charges that have been made, and evidence that is accumulating about the exercise of power under the current political administration. I have a general view about retrospective accountability for the alleged transgressions of people who had immediately been in power in a preceding government that was democratically elected anywhere in the world as a general rule. And that view is not that there should never be prosecutions, but that if there are prosecutions against people who were in power in a previous administration, it's very important that the following rules apply. Number one, there needs to be a rule of law. And a rule of law requires truly neutral and independent functioning of both the prosecution and the judiciary. So it's important that the judicial process happen in a way where there is independence from political power and there is the perception of independence from political power. And if there is a perception that the process of judicial accountability and legal prosecution is being politicized, that prosecutors are being maybe directed in some way against the political opposition, that there's a hunt to find judges who will be more sympathetic to the government of the day in adjudicating the cases, this is worrisome for the rule of law. That's the first rule. The second rule is, if there are going to be prosecutions of people who had exercised bureaucratic and political authority in the previous administration, it's very important that the charges be very serious, so as not to give the impression, not to mention the reality, that the prosecutions are politically motivated, that the government is looking for anything it can find to try and punish the previous government and ruling party. And so I think it's always important to examine the charges and say, do these rise to the level of seriousness to justify the always ever-present worry, perception, or risk that maybe this is being politically motivated. And there are other things that could be cited about pre-trial detention and so on. But if you're asking the question, is there cause for concern, I'd say, yeah, there's prima facie evidence that is cause for concern about the independence of the judicial process and the possibility that it is being used at least partly for political purposes. And I can't judge one way or another, but if that's happening, it's a very, very grave violation of the rule of law.
According to public opinion polls, majority of Georgian population believes that country is run by an informal ruler, like a billionaire who won 2012 elections. He left the government in a year or so and now claims to be the representative of the civil society. Actually, the government admits that he is, the Bidzina Ivanishvili is the most influential person. They even call him the first citizen. How does such kind of governance influence the development of the country?
Well, again, you'd have to be more of an expert. You'd have to be an expert on Georgia to give an authoritative answer to the question. So let me try and answer your question as someone with a comparative knowledge and a scholar of democracy who has an interest in Georgia and a concern about its political and economic development and its civic health. Let me try and give an answer from that perspective. The most important word underlying the concept of democracy, I believe, is accountability. Accountability in multiple senses. First of all, there has to be political accountability of the government to the people on an ongoing basis, but certainly at regular intervals in elections. And second of all, for there to be a quality democracy, there has to be accountability in the use of public funds, in the flow of political money, and the relationship between money and decision-making, money and political influence. In the former respect of direct political accountability, you cannot have a situation where the most powerful figure in the country is not a political office holder, but someone who is funding and giving instructions to those who are political office holders. You cannot have that and have a fundamentally democratic situation, because the ultimate agent of authority in the country is not democratically accountable. If that is the case, and one would need to know more about Georgia than I can claim to know. I know there are many people in Georgia who believe that is the case, and you have said that a majority of Georgians in a public opinion poll have said they believe that is the case. If that is the case, it is a very fundamental violation of one of the most basic principles of democracy, which is that those who exercise political power must be accountable. Then, secondly, a basic principle of a quality democracy is transparency in the flow of party and campaign finance and in the personal finances of people who hold the public trust, either legislative or bureaucratic or political. If it is the case, and I cannot evaluate it, but if it is the case, as some Georgians allege, that a wealthy individual is providing personal funding to members, certain members of the legislature and certain members of the state, I'd say this is really, wow, this is a very serious problem for the rule of law and democratic accountability.
Well, what is the correlation between economic strength of the country and democracy? Because there is a claim that it is impossible to build democracy in a very poor state.
No, that's patently false, because we know of many countries that have started from relative poverty and have built viable and reasonably robust democracies. The most obvious case is India. Let me tell you, when India started at its independence in 1947, it was much poorer than Georgia could ever imagine being in the post-communist era. And one could cite other countries like Sri Lanka and now Ghana in Africa has been, as a pretty poor country, much poorer than Georgia, a pretty successful democracy for some period of time. Costa Rica started as a very poor country, but a continuous democracy for many decades in Latin America. So to say it's impossible is a ridiculous proposition. But it does need to be said that if you are going to maintain and grow democracy in a country with low per capita income, you do need to generate economic growth. You can't have economic stagnation. And you need reasonably robust civic and political institutions, political parties, parliament, a free press, and so on, strong civil society.
Let's move to international issues, like 2 or 3 questions about that. Like, Russia has become not just a venal and despotic state, but a neo-imperial menace to its neighbors as well. That's, I'm quoting you now, welcome to one of its neighbors. How would you evaluate the response of the West to this threat posed by Putin, to the free world?
I think it's been inadequate. I think that Russia under Putin, and therefore Putin himself, are testing the West. There has not, I mean, we've not seen, 10,000 tanks roll into Ukraine. It's been a salami slicing, it's been, you take Crimea and you see what happens. You infiltrate eastern Ukraine with these very ambiguous armed men who are Russian soldiers but are not wearing Russian military uniforms, then you see what happens. You take a little piece of eastern Ukraine, and then you take a little more, and then you prepare to move down, as I think Russia is preparing to move down and create a land bridge to Crimea, and then again it'll see what happens. So it's a constant matter of probing, of testing, of trying to record territorial gains and claim nationalistic victories to make up for the failures of governance and the failures of development inside Russia itself, because It's not like Putin can point to his economic success in Russia or his success in public health in Russia, when the mortality rate for Russian men is one of the lowest of even middle-income countries in the world. He's got very few domestic governance or development successes to point to, so he's using, as historically other autocrats have in time, aggression and military conquest as a way of making up for it. I don't think that's a sustainable project, but it's causing a lot of damage to regional security, human rights, and freedom in the interim, and I think we need, from the United States, NATO, Europe, the West in general, a much more vigorous response. For one obvious thing, I think the Ukrainians have a right to defend themselves. And for the, for people in the West to say, and if I can say so with all due respect for the Obama administration, to say, well, we don't really want to give them lethal weapons because, Russia will just then up the game and then the Ukrainians will be worse off. Who are we to judge, what Ukraine should be willing to fight for when its own territory is being swallowed as a violation of international law by a neighboring power? I think the Ukrainians deserve the right to defend their territory, their sovereignty, and to have whatever they're asking for within reason, in terms of particularly defensive weapons capability to do that.
What is your take regarding the claim that America is a declining power?
I don't think America is a declining power. I think that we're going through a difficult period. Our democracy isn't functioning well. We have a lot of political polarization. But, if you think America is a declining power, answer the following questions. Number one, of the advanced industrial countries in the world, which is the one that has recovered from the economic crisis of 2008 most vigorously and sustainably? U.S. economy is coming back. It's
we
really,
feel that.
Regenerating economic growth and jobs in a pretty impressive way. Number two, if you think China is overtaking the United States, ask yourself this question. Which country is most likely to have political stability and a strong, legitimate political system that looks like the one today in, say, 10 or 20 years from now, China or the United States? In fact, I can say that 20 years from now, not only the United States and every country in the European Union will have exactly the same political system it does now, but so will India. 20 years from now, I feel very confident in saying India will be a constitutional federal democracy. At some point in the next 20 years, communist rule is going to collapse in China. It's going to go through either incremental change, which I don't see happening, or a major cataclysmic political crisis, because communism is not a viable system for managing the social stresses and demands of an increasingly modern, pluralistic, advanced economy and society. So, the answer is relative to what? The United States has still, in the macro sense, in the long run, a stable and resilient democracy and a pretty resourceful and innovative economy. Look at the vulnerabilities of China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, the other non-democratic G20 countries, and then look at the other major democracies of the world, whether it's Brazil or India or so on. They face a lot of challenges as well. It's a more multipolar world. It will continue to become a more multipolar world. But I think for a very long time to come, the United States will be the most important source of economic growth and democratic leadership in the world.
Well, thank you. And the last question, you have expressed some worries about the recession of the democracy around the world. Do you see any connection between the US foreign policy and the recession of democracy like elsewhere?
Yes, unfortunately I do. Let me say, the recession of democracy in the world so far has been a relatively mild one. That is, there has not been a massive reverse wave of democratic failures, but there has been a rising tide of democratic breakdowns. And in each decade of the third wave of democracy, from the early 1980s to the early 1990s, and then the early 90s to the early 2000s, and then now, there's been a rising rate of democratic failure. 14% of all the democracies that existed in the last decade have failed. Freedom is at least slightly eroding in the world, and democratic growth came to a halt about 9 or 10 years ago in the world. So we have a lot of work to do. And yes, the United States has not been vigorous enough in pushing this back and in supporting democratic progress in the world and rallying other established democracies to promote democracy. We need to do more.
Well, thank you, Mr. Diamond, for finding time in your tight and very busy schedule again. Thanks for a very interesting conversation. Hope to see you sometime and talk to you again sometime soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.